Dawn in western Ukraine, late June 1941. A German tank platoon noses along a dirt track that has already turned to powder. The men are tired but confident. In 3 days they have learned the new rhythm: drive, probe, fire, move, while their maps fall behind reality. Then the lead vehicle brakes so hard the commander's teeth click. Across a low rise, something broad and angular is pushing through a rye field, not fast, not slow, just steady. The silhouette is wrong. The turret looks like a blunt dome. The hull sits low. The tracks are wide enough to look like snowshoes. A 37mm anti-tank gun, dragged into place by breathless infantry, cracks in the shell, hits with a sharp metallic slap that should have meant a kill. Instead, it skitters away, and the strange tank keeps coming. That is the shock of 1941. Not the myth that one machine saved anyone, but an engineering ambush. A design that changed the math of what enough gun and enough armor meant. Right when the German system depended on quick, repeatable kills. By the end of this story, you'll understand why the T-34 shape mattered, why it wasn't a miracle, and how both sides learned, fast, what the sloped armor era actually cost. Exhibit A is the angle, not the thickness. Sloped armor does two harsh things at once. First, it forces a projectile to chew through more metal because the path through the plate becomes longer when you hit at an angle. Second, it increases the chance of a ricochet, especially at longer ranges and imperfect impact. For crews trained on flatter targets, slope punished good shooting. A gun that had been adequate became unreliable. And unreliable means you spend time you do not have. The T-34 put that slope on the part of the vehicle that takes the first blow, the glacis. Pair it with a low profile and a wide stance, and you get a target that is harder to range, harder to hit squarely, and harder to stop. In early encounters, German accounts describe rounds that cracked paint but didn't crack steel, and the unnerving moment when a tank you believe was dead swings its turret anyway. Operational reality implies the same conclusion. If your frontline anti-tank weapon cannot reliably kill the enemy tank at the ranges your doctrine expects, your tempo turns into negotiation. Exhibit B is the track, because the Eastern Front is not one terrain. It is a calendar of terrains. Summer dust, autumn mud, winter ice, spring thaw. Each season tries to turn movement into a wager. Wide tracks spread weight. They lower ground pressure. They raise the odds that you keep moving when the ground tries to swallow you. That matters because a tank's best armor is position. If you can climb a soft bank, cross a torn field, or pivot in mud without bogging, you can choose angles, break contact, and avoid being fixed in place when the ground turns bad. Time is what German spearheads could not spare. Their advance depended on a clean loop. Recon finds anti-tank assets kill, panzers pass through, infantry follows, fuel trucks catch up. The T-34 did not break that loop everywhere, but it introduced friction at the worst points. Road junctions, narrow bridges, village edges, places where columns compress and decisions pile up. A single T-34 appearing at a crossroads could delay a march long enough for Soviet guns to reposition, for demolitions to fire, or for a local retreat to organize. But machines are not only steel, they are crews and routines. The Red Army in 1941 was absorbing blows that would have shattered most armies. Surprise, air attacks on forward depots, units cut off, orders arriving late or not at all. In that environment, the T-34's strengths came with a hidden bill. Many early tanks did not carry radios in every vehicle, so control often reverted to flags, flares, and pre-briefed intent. Fine on a parade ground, risky in a moving fight. Visibility could also be cramped through narrow optics, which made first-shot hits harder. Then there was the factory truth. Soviet industry was building under pressure that soon became evacuation, simplifying parts, accepting rougher finishes, because quantity had become a weapon. A design can be advanced and still suffer in execution when weld quality, gearbox tolerances, and crew training are uneven. Reports describe transmissions that were heavy and failure-prone early on, and field maintenance that demanded strength, tools, and time, things rarely available on a collapsing front. Now return to that rye field. The German platoon leader has a decision that is tactical but also systemic. Keep firing the light gun and hope for a lucky hit on a track, or change the geometry. Crews learn to flank, to close distance, to aim for weaker areas, to call for heavier weapons, to use smoke and artillery to blind and immobilize. In the short term, that meant more radio traffic, more coordination, more exposure. In a war of minutes, flanking is a tax you pay in fuel and casualties. Notice what changes when your few tools become mandatory. Columns lengthen because you must include heavier-towed guns and their tractors. Setup times grow because heavier guns need better positions. Fuel spend rises because everything is heavier and the front is farther. Every technical fix casts a logistics shadow, and in 1941, that shadow was already chasing the Germans. So the T-34 sloped armor is less a wall than a wedge. It pried open the gap between German expectation and Soviet reality. It forced gunners to admit their reliable kill system had limits. It gave Soviet crews a machine that could survive first contact more often, which is the only chance you get to learn in combat. But it also demanded training, coordination, and maintenance the Red Army could not always provide in that summer's chaos. The question then is not whether the T-34 was unbeatable. It wasn't. The question is when the German army found a repeatable way to beat it, and what that solution cost them everywhere else. To beat it, the Germans didn't need a single genius trick. They needed a new kind of certainty, one that could be repeated in mud, smoke, and panic by average crews on a bad day. That search for certainty begins not in a design office, but beside a road where a light gun crew realizes they can't practice harder into a kill. The first shift was brutally practical. Change the weight of the answer. A heavier anti-tank gun brings more penetration, but it also brings setup time, towing problems, and exhaustion. When German commanders started pulling more 50mm and 75mm anti-tank guns forward, they were also pulling forward horses, tractors, prime movers, fuel, spare tires, and the men who knew how to keep them moving. The front line didn't just get a better punch, it got longer and hungrier. The second shift was geometric. If the T-34's glasses turned front shots into coin flips, the new rule became, don't bet on the front. That meant flanking fire, crossfires, and ambush angles that forced a tank to show its side. It sounds obvious, but it changes everything about timing. A flank is not a thought. It's minutes of movement under observation. It demands coordination between infantry, guns, and tanks. And coordination depends on communications that could still crack under dust, jamming, shell fire, and severed wires. This is where the war stops being about a single tank and becomes a system argument. The German way of war depended on tempo, and tempo depends on short decision loops. Recon sees, commander decides, guns fire, obstacle disappears. The T-34 stretch those loops. A target that might survive the first hit forces a second decision. Do you stay and finish, or do you bypass and accept risk behind you? Either choice burns time, and in 1941, time was often more precious than steel. Near the Oka River in early autumn, accounts describe a pattern that repeats. Soviet tanks appear at the edge of woods or from behind a village, fire on columns, then slip away before heavier assets can be brought to bear. It isn't magic, it's positioning. A tank that can cross softer ground and shrug off light shots can choose when the engagement starts. German responses were telling. They began placing heavier guns at likely choke points, building prepared answer sites where a tank would have to enter a narrow kill zone. But heavier guns create their own vulnerability. They are slow to move, and once spotted, they become magnets for artillery and small arms pressure. So the third shift was about concealment and discipline. Crews learned to hide muzzle flashes, to wait for closer ranges, to mask the gun with brush and netting, and to resist the urge to fire too early. Patience became a technical skill. The right shot wasn't simply a hit. It was a hit at a range and angle where slope could not bargain your result. Then there's the ammunition problem, the quiet constraint underneath every confident story. Penetration is not only caliber, it's velocity, projectile design, and sometimes scarce materials. Contemporary reports describe special high-velocity rounds that performed well, but depended on limited supplies. That is a classic wartime trade. You can buy performance with rare resources, but you cannot scale it cleanly across an army. So doctrine had to assume ordinary ammunition, not a miracle crate that miraculously appears at the right moment. At the same time, German tank units began demanding different tools from their own vehicles. If you cannot trust a close-range brawl against a tank that survives frontal hits, you ask for better optics, better sights, better radios, and guns that can win at range. Because range gives you more tries before the enemy reaches you. The shift toward higher velocity tank guns is often told as inevitable. But in 1941, it was also a logistics gamble. Bigger guns mean heavier turrets, higher recoil loads, and new maintenance burdens. Now flip the camera to the Soviet side because the T-34's real story is also about learning under fire. The early war Red Army often had the better design on paper and the worst conditions in practice. Crew training was uneven. Radios were inconsistent. Maintenance support was shattered by encirclements, air attacks, and sheer distance. A tank that is hard to kill is still useless if it cannot find fuel, if it cannot coordinate, or if it breaks down after a day of hard marching. So Soviet planners leaned into what they could scale: simplicity and volume. Production pressure forced design compromises that look crude in a museum, but make sense on a rail siding under threat. Welding that is functional rather than pretty. Parts that can be swapped with fewer machining steps. Procedures that can be taught quickly to new workers after factories move east. Operational reality implies that a good enough tank you can replace is sometimes more valuable than a perfect tank you cannot. That is the hidden duel. Germany tried to restore certainty through better killing tools and better tactical geometry. The Soviet Union tried to restore certainty through replacement and continuity, keeping enough tanks and crews at the front that local defeats did not turn into operational collapse. And both approaches have costs you can measure: fuel tonnage, towing capacity, spare parts flow. training throughput, and the number of daylight hours wasted dragging a gun into position. By late 1941, the Germans were finding more repeatable ways to stop a T-34. But notice what had changed. Their anti-tank defense became heavier, more deliberate, more dependent on prepared positions and combined arms. That may win fights, but it slows an advance that was built to keep moving. Meanwhile, the Soviets were beginning, unevenly, to fix the things that turned strong design into weak practice. More reliable command links where possible, more standardized maintenance routines, and growing discipline in how crews were trained and committed. The next question is whether either side could keep this new machine running when winter arrived, and the ground itself became the strongest weapon of all. And that search for certainty begins with a winter road, because winter turns every theory into a receipt. Late 1941, outside a half-burned village on the approaches to Moscow, a T-34 sits half-sunk in churned snow. Its engine is still running, exhaust pulsing into the cold like a signal flare. German infantry can hear it before they see it, and the sound matters, because it means the tank can still move, and a moving tank changes every decision around it. Here is what people get wrong when they talk about winter like it's a single problem. Winter isn't one obstacle. It is a stack of small failures that arrive together. Fuel thickens, batteries weaken, oil turns stubborn, metal contracts, fingers go numb, optics frost, and radios die at the exact moment you need coordination. When those failures stack, armor doesn't just fight the enemy, it fights the calendar. Exhibit C is the T-34's powertrain in the cold, not as a brochure claim, but as a daily process. A diesel engine can offer real advantages, less volatile fuel, often better torque characteristics, and different fire risks, but it does not make you immune to winter. The real difference is whether the system around the engine can keep it alive. Preheating routines, fuel handling, oil selection, spare filters, trained hands, and time. If a unit lacks those, the tank becomes a frozen sculpture, no matter how modern its armor looks. So what did crews do? They improvised the way armies always do when doctrine meets frost. They kept engines running longer than they should, burning precious fuel to avoid a dead start later. They parked with intent, choosing positions that reduced drift buildup and made tow recovery possible. They cannibalized parts from immobile vehicles because the supply chain could not beat distance and mud. And they learned quickly that the weakest link was often not the gun or armor, but the minutes required to wake a machine in the dark. On the German side, the winter lesson was equally sharp. Heavy anti-tank guns and better tactics could stop a T-34, sometimes decisively, but only if the guns arrived, were emplaced, and had clear fields of fire. In deep snow, with trucks bogging and horses exhausted, the gun that exists on paper can be 2 hours away in reality. That delay is what a moving tank exploits. Now anchor it to a specific kind of contact. A small German Kampfgruppe has been ordered to hold a road junction overnight. They have infantry, a few light vehicles, and one anti-tank gun crew that is already half frozen. The sentry hears track clatter, then sees a low silhouette drifting between trees. The first shot is not about heroism, it's about angle. If the gun is forced into a frontal hit on a sloped plate, the crew is gambling. If they can wait, shift the trail, and take a side shot, they can buy certainty. But waiting costs them something too. The tank closes distance, machine gun fire starts to rake the hedgerow, and the gun crew's hands are shaking as they try to seat around. This is the trade-off the T-34 creates. It pushes the defender into perfect timing requirements. The answer is discipline, but discipline is expensive under stress. And in winter, it gets worse, because every second you spend adjusting a gun in the open is a second you can't feel your fingers. Exhibit D is not a weapon at all. It is the recovery and repair loop. Tanks break in winter, guns break in winter, trucks break in winter. The question is which side can turn broken into usable again faster. A tank that throws a track is not lost if you can fix it, tow it, or strip it for parts before the enemy reaches it. But towing in mud and snow is its own engineering problem. Tow cables snap, prime movers bog, and men run out of daylight. This is why armies obsess over tractors, winches, spare track links, and train recovery crews. They decide how many vehicles return tomorrow. Operational reality implies that the Soviet advantage here was not simply the T-34 as a single machine, but the willingness to treat machines as a flow. If a tank is immobile and cannot be recovered quickly, you strip it and move on. If you can recover it, you do. If you cannot, you replace it. That logic only works if your production and training pipelines can refill the front faster than the front consumes them. And that brings us to the hidden industrial engine behind the T-34's winter presence. During the emergency relocations east, factories were moved, rebuilt, and restarted under brutal conditions. That process did not produce perfection, it produced output. Welding could be rough, finishes could be coarse, but what matters in a throughput war is whether a tank arrives at the railhead, whether it can be assembled quickly, and whether it can be fielded with a crew that knows the minimum to fight. If you can do that repeatedly, the enemy's tactical solutions become a treadmill. Germany, meanwhile, is paying its own winter bill. If stopping T-34s requires heavier guns, better ammunition, more careful ambush geometry, and more combined arms coordination, then Germany is spending time and logistics to restore certainty. But those resources are not infinite. More heavy guns forward means more towing and fuel. More prepared positions means slower movement. More ammunition consumption means more resupply runs on roads that are now ice and mud. And the psychological effect matters. A weapon that survives the first normal answer forces units to change behavior. Infantry become cautious about open crossings. Convoys demand escorts. Commanders delay moves until they can bring heavier assets. Each of those is rational locally, and each of those slows the operational machine. The T-34 slope isn't only steel, it is a time tax. Now flip back to the Soviet crew inside the tank. Winter also punishes them. Visibility shrinks. Condensation freezes on periscopes. The engine compartment is both heat and hazard. A driver is steering by feel when the track bites unevenly. The gunner is trying to judge range in flat light where every tree line looks the same. When the tank fires, recoil shudders through metal that is already stiff with cold. The crew is not living inside a myth. They are living inside a loud, vibrating, freezing box that must still function. So why does the T-34 still matter in this environment? Because it can do one crucial thing often enough. Move where the enemy is least ready and keep moving after the first hit fails. That forces defenders to either overbuild their answers everywhere, impossible, or accept risk in some places, dangerous. The tank becomes a lever that shifts German resources away from offense and into emergency defense, one junction at a time. But winter also exposes the T-34's own bottlenecks. Maintenance tempo becomes brutal. Spare parts get scarce. Training gaps show up as broken transmissions, thrown tracks, and poor gunnery under pressure. The Soviet system can accept losses, but it cannot accept chaos forever. If the tank is going to remain a repeatable tool, not just a scary surprise, the Red Army needs something more than raw production. The next constraint is command and control at scale. How a mass of tanks becomes a coordinated punch instead of scattered shocks. Because once the snow begins to melt, the side that can synchronize movement, fuel, recovery, and radios will decide whether the T-34 is merely hard to kill or hard to stop. Because once the snow begins to melt, the side that can synchronize movement, fuel, recovery, and radios will decide whether the T-34 is merely hard to kill or hard to stop. And that question did not live inside the armor plate. It lived inside the headset. Early in the war, many T-34s went into action without radios in every tank. Some crews had them, many did not. And a formation that cannot talk must signal with flags and guesswork. Under artillery, drift becomes deadly. The front tank pivots left, the next hesitates, the third loses sight in dust, and a mass that should hit like a fist arrives like fingers. Exhibit C is command and control under violence, the hidden cost of good tanks used without a good nervous system. Radios do not add millimeters of armor, they add repeatability. They let a commander cancel a bad move fast, shift fire, tighten spacing, and stop a pursuit before it becomes a trap. Anchor the moment to late spring near Kharkov, when roads turn soft and the horizon becomes a low-gray smear. A Soviet tank group is told to push through a gap and cut a line behind advancing infantry. The first minutes feel like victory. Diesel engines pull, tracks bite, and the sloped hulls throw off small arms fire like rain. Then the geometry breaks. A lead tank crests a rise and sees German anti-tank crews dragging a gun into a hedgerow line. The commander wants the column to fan out. 2 left, 2 right, while the rest keeps rolling. But half the vehicles cannot hear him. He stands in the hatch, flags snapping in the slipstream, trying to turn a battlefield into a drill. A gun flashes, a short burst of dust and smoke. The round does not need to pierce the thickest plate to change the day. It only needs to break a track, jam a turret ring, or force a crew out. The first T-34 lurches, a link snapping, and slews across the path. The tanks behind brake hard, and now the column is a single file of targets, stalled in mud, with limited room to turn. This is what people get wrong when they treat sloped armor as a cheat code. The armor can survive a hit, but the unit can still be paralyzed by a hit. War is not only about what dies, it is about what stops. So the real fight becomes a throughput problem. Can you clear the blockage faster than the enemy can stack more trouble on top of it? Now you see why recovery mattered. A knocked-out tank is obvious. A disabled tank is expensive. If you cannot tow it, you abandon it. If you abandon it, you lose the repairable hull, the crew, and the parts you will wish you had tomorrow. Recovery vehicles are the shadow army that decides whether your losses are permanent. The Soviets learned this under pressure. They adapted with field repair, tractors and improvised tows, crews swapping track pins in the open, commanders choosing when to break contact instead of feeding tanks into a narrow kill zone. None of that shows up in a silhouette chart, yet it changes the math of a campaign. Meanwhile, the Germans adapted too, and their adaptation was layered. They improved guns, pushed anti-tank pieces forward, and changed where they aimed. They learned that a hit that breaks mobility can be as valuable as a hit that burns. They treated the T-34 as a problem of angle and distance. Get side shots, force turns, Lure tanks into soft ground where speed becomes fatigue? A well-sighted anti-tank gun does not need to chase a tank. It waits. It uses concealment and rehearsed drill to turn a fast thrust into a sequence of halted targets. When a tank unit loses momentum, it loses its one true advantage: initiative. Exhibit D is the trade the Soviets accepted to scale. Build a tank that could be produced and operated in brutal conditions, then pay back missing sophistication with doctrine, training, and repetition. Accounts suggest many early crews were rushed. They learned in motion, and the cost of learning was measured in stalled machines and missed openings. But that is also why the T-34 becomes more dangerous over time. Not because the steel changes, but because the system around it learns. Radios spread. Crew drills tighten. Units learn how to screen with infantry and coordinate with artillery, so a hedgerow does not stay quiet when it shouldn't. Factories simplify fittings, so a gearbox swap is faster, and depots learn which seals fail first. Ammunition loads get standardized. Fuel convoys get routed around the worst ground, and battalions learn to keep a few tanks back as a moving reserve instead of committing every hull at once. That is how a design becomes a doctrine. A tank is a moving compromise. The T-34's compromise was blunt: accept roughness, accept visibility limits, accept hard ergonomics, and buy speed of production and fieldable power. That works only if the operating system can absorb its own friction. So what decided whether the shock of 1941 stayed a shock? Spare parts forward, not in a distant depot. Fuel staged where mud did not swallow trucks. Mechanics who triage fast, not perfectly. Commanders who stop a charge when the ground turns into glue. Radios, finally, so a breakthrough becomes an exploitation, not a series of isolated lunges. In the end, the T-34 did not win because it was invulnerable. It won because it was survivable enough, cheap enough, and simple enough to keep returning, while a whole industrial and logistical machine learned to feed it and fix it. The Germans could destroy tanks. They struggled to destroy the replacement cycle. Perfection wasn't the point. Availability was. Armor wasn't the weapon. Tempo was. And the sloped hull was only the start. Thanks for watching. If you want more World War II stories told through real constraints and mechanisms, subscribe. Link is in the description.